Hello and welcome to today's episode where we have the privilege of hearing from Professor Marja-Liisa Öberg, an Associate Professor of EU Law at Lund University in Sweden and a leading expert in EU constitutional and external relations law. Marja-Liisa is here to discuss her latest article, Friend Zone Forever, the Essence of and Justifications for the EU's Decision-Making Autonomy, which is part of a special issue titled Third Country Influence on EU Law and Policymaking, Setting the Scene, also edited by Marja-Liisa, along with her co-editor Sandra Lavenex of the University of Geneva. Today we'll be unpacking the concept of the EU's decision-making autonomy, its implications for third country relations, and the broader question of how the EU navigates its relationships with non-member states. So, get ready for an insightful discussion that explores the heart of European integration and the evolving nature of the EU's global interactions. A very warm welcome to the podcast, Marja-Liisa. So before we dive into your research, can you explain what exactly is decision-making autonomy and really why it matters for European member states?
Yes, decision-making autonomy is a concept that balances the benefits and obligations of the member states within EU membership. Basically, decision-making autonomy is a clear dividing line between the member states of the Union who share both the benefits and disadvantages of being members of an international organization in which they pool sovereignty, in which they assume a set of risks in terms of adhering to decisions which they may not necessarily have participated in themselves, such as in the case of decisions adopted by qualified majority voting. So, decision-making autonomy protects the prerogatives of the member states because they do not only enjoy the benefits, they also carry the disadvantages of membership. In order to maintain the attractiveness of membership versus cherry-picking policies to which would be beneficial for a third country to adhere to without carrying the risks of membership, the EU is strictly guarding the boundaries of who can participate in the formal adoption of the rules that bind the membership.
The protection, I suppose, of those member states, of course, comes with its own pros and cons, which I'm sure you'll speak a bit more about. So what inspired you to focus your research on this sort of balancing act you've described between preserving sovereignty and the external influence of other countries?
I did my PhD thesis on the question of where is the dividing line between EU member states and non-EU member states, which I also call third countries, in terms of participation in the internal market. And I was interested in looking at to what extent can third countries become full members of the internal market as close as the status of the member states within the internal market without becoming formally member states of the European Union. After I finished that project, I got a funding for a postdoc project looking at the other side of that coin. So instead of considering the norms export or the export of the EU acquis from the Union to third countries as a one-way linear process, with EU as the origin of the norms and third countries as their recipients, I was interested in looking at in questioning that linearity and looking at what is the possibility for third countries to in turn influence the content of those rules that they will later be adopting within their legal orders before they have been made part of EU law. Within this project, I embarked on collaboration with Sandra Lavenex from the University of Geneva. And together we organized a conference looking at this question from a multidisciplinary perspective involving political scientists and lawyers. And the results were published in the special issue of the Journal of Common Market Studies. From a lawyerly perspective, the question of third country influence is difficult to study because it is something that happens a lot in practice. It is to a large extent informal. But the very interesting question there is, how does the EU's political and legal order react to third countries' influence on the making of the EU's rules and policies? So that is basically the concept of decision-making autonomy. And since I had been studying the concept of autonomy of the EU legal order before in my PhD thesis, I was very keen to understand what exactly is the decision-making autonomy of the EU, what purpose does it serve, and what effects does it have.
Sounds like a very clear and interesting direction then when it comes to your research, to look at those third countries, a very natural fit and direction for you. As someone from the UK, but now living in Europe, I am particularly interested in my next question for you. From your research, have you found ways, direct or indirect, that these countries, these third countries, can still have influence on the EU's decision-making? And if so, what avenues?
Because the formal ways for third countries to participate in the actual adoption of EU norms is non-existent. The voting in the Council is strictly and only limited to the member states. Then the only ways for third countries to be involved in any stage of a legislative or pre-legislative process is through limited formalized means or completely informal means. The most formalized means of third country influence on the making of EU laws and policies is the decision-shaping possibility granted to the countries of the European Economic Area. That includes Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. So they can participate in the pre-legislative stages of agenda setting and shaping the content of the norms, but they do not participate in the formal adoption of EU acquis. Looking beyond that, the picture becomes much blurrier and much more informal. Within the special issue, we identified two main sets of potential third country influence. The one includes intergovernmental avenues, and the other one comprises influence through EU institutions, bodies, and agencies. So in terms of the former, the possibilities for third countries to influence EU laws and policies via intergovernmental negotiations. This includes, for example, political importance of certain agreements concluded between the EU and third countries, such as, for example, the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement / Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Area Agreement, in which the political relevance of the agreement is so big that in order to keep it afloat, the EU is willing to make concessions or to give a certain effect to the agreement within its own legal and political system, which is not necessarily demanded by the third country counterparts themselves. And that has to do with the broader geopolitical context. The other examples include the relationship between the EU and Turkey. The EU is, to a large extent, dependent on Turkey in terms of certain policies, such as common security and defense policy and migration policy in particular. The EU is also involved in security cooperation via NATO with Turkey. Hence, the relationship with Turkey has such political relevance that Turkey has a possibility of influencing certain political processes in the EU, in particular the entire policy area of migration law, which is not available to other third countries. And the third avenue that I could mention here is the lobbying. This is not necessarily the influence of third countries or their institutions, but can also include, for example, large companies or state-owned companies from third countries. Lobbying is a big issue that has become more regulated in the EU and in EU member states and in countries around the world recently. And the regulation of lobbying obviously has a significant impact on the possibilities of third countries or third country actors in influencing the making of policies and laws within the European Union.
I see. So there are like limited and informal means of doing so. It's very interesting to hear of those possible avenues of influence, but also positively, I suppose, for the EU, how it's protecting itself in those more formal arenas. So what are the potential risks or the cons, let's say, if the EU didn't protect itself like this?
The disadvantages to allowing third countries similar prerogatives of participating in EU decision-making and the adoption of common laws and policies, while they have not adhered to the entire package of membership, is basically the loosening of the fabric of membership. It would be much less attractive to be bound by all of EU's laws and policies in the common form if one could only opt in to the most beneficial of these without having to carry the entire burden of membership. Hence, the main con of allowing third countries to participate would be the loss of attractiveness of membership in its entirety, and thereby the strength of the union as a whole.
There is a lot to lose. Although in your article, just to bring it back to your work, you also explore whether the EU should adopt a more flexible approach to decision-making autonomy. So what do you then see as the potential benefits of loosening that strict insider-outsider distinction?
Indeed, I already discussed the cons of doing that, and that would be the weakening of the EU's edifice and undermining the pooling of sovereignty, mutual trust, and the risk of future developments of EU integration. However, the benefits to allowing third countries a greater say at least in the initial stages of shaping EU law would be to grant them a possibility of representation. There is a perceived democratic deficit in the third countries that adopt EU norms because formally third countries have to follow their constitutional procedures in order to adopt rules of EU origin into their legal order. So they have a formal possibility of saying no to rules that originate from the EU, but in practice, the political cost of doing that is too high. So it does not happen much or at all in practice. So allowing third countries a possibility to participate in the making or shaping of EU norms at some stage is an important from the perspective of representation and democratic processes. There is also the value of allowing third countries to be involved early on in the adoption of new EU acquis and to also contribute substantively to the content of those norms from the perspective of their later implementation and enforcement within the third country legal orders. Early involvement in the rules, understanding where they come from, what they're about, how they should be implemented, is a learning process that will help for higher quality in the later implementation exercises. So securing that would be beneficial for the third countries as well as for the EU and for the integrity of the internal market, for example, if the aim of the norms export is to ensure an expanded internal market.
Looking ahead, do you think the EU's decision-making autonomy will remain as rigid as it is today? Do you foresee pressures for a more inclusive model?
Realistically, I cannot see any concrete pressures for changing the current status quo in terms of decision-making autonomy and the formal avenues available for third countries to participate in the shaping of these norms, not even going as far as the actual adoption of norms within the EU. I would say the balance between the EU and the third countries in terms of decision-making autonomy has a lot to do with the health and the integrity of the EU at any given moment. the more coherent and cohesive EU integration, the more likely it would be that third countries be given a stronger say in the making of EU rules and policies. However, the more problematic the integration process within the EU, just to name Brexit as a shock to the system, the more likely the member states are to protect their privileges and to clearly demarcate membership and member states from non-membership and from non-member states. Hence, it would be less likely for third countries to be given a cherry-picking opportunity of opting in to certain policies. The smaller the possibility for third countries to opt into certain policies, either on their own will or because they are not yet far advanced in an accession process, with the ensuing possibilities to shape the making of EU laws and policies.
Right, yeah. There's a really interesting point to think about how, for example, Brexit, as you've mentioned, has played its part in changing then the integration process and the health status, let's say, of the EU. How do you think the influence of non-EU countries like the UK, but also others, impacts core European values like democracy, transparency, and rule of law, which is, of course, what our network is exploring? Like, for example, do you see the EU's openness right now to outside influence as supporting those values, or might it be putting them at risk?
This is an excellent question. This is again a question that pertains to the linear influence of the EU, its normative power, its norms export, etc. What comes back to the EU from that? Does anything come back, or should anything come back? It is a question of changing perspectives. It is a question of looking at what the EU could learn from the outside. Here I would want to refer to the article within the special issue, which was authored by Calypso Nicolaidis and Richard Youngs, which specifically asked for reversing the gaze of the EU in order to look at what the EU has to learn from the rest of the world in terms of democratization processes. Indeed, there are many different processes in terms of democratization, rule of law, and transparency happening all across the world. The question is the EU interested in following them? Does the EU have anything to learn from them? Are they qualitatively better or a source of learning? And then also, does the EU have the institutional possibilities to take in those experiences that happen elsewhere? In this article, Nicolaidis and Youngs lay out a program for the EU to better accommodate these experiences across the globe and to make better use of them. They also note that the EU is missing the institutional avenues for adequately bringing in those experiences and putting them to use for the improvement of the EU and its own processes.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Marja-Liisa. It's been a real pleasure to learn from you today.
Thank you so much on my behalf. It was absolutely lovely to be in this podcast with you.
Listeners, of course, if you're interested to know more about decision-making autonomy in the EU and those outside third countries, please do check out Marja-Liisa's article, which will be in the podcast description, along with a link also to the full special issue. Thank you very much for tuning in today to this lovely podcast. If you liked what you heard, please leave us a comment somewhere. We're on YouTube, Spotify, SoundCloud, and you can listen to this through our website as well. So until next time, take care, stay informed, and tune in soon.